Hi, good morning. This is our third or fourth knowledge sharing seminar, and we are really happy to have Prof Ann Marie Fallon from St. John Fisher College back with us. And Prof Ann Marie has presented to us before on the subject of liberal education, and today we are also very happy to welcome Prof Ann Marie to talk to us on the topic of liberal education in the age of COVID-19. I know Prof Ann Marie because Prof Ann has visited PPIB in UMS a couple of times, and I would, for the sake of our audience, I'm just going to read a short biodata of Prof Ann. Ann Marie Fallon was appointed as Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences in St. John Fisher College, and this is in New York. She leads the college's largest school, which is home to more than 1,000 undergraduates, and who are enrolled in over 30 majors in the humanities, social sciences, and the natural sciences. Dr. Fallon holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from Swarthmore College and earned her master's and doctoral degrees in English literature from the University of Virginia. In 2004, she was selected as a Fulbright Junior Lecturer in the American Studies and inaugural visiting professor at the Center for American Studies at the University of Trier, Germany. A scholarship which explored both critical analysis and post-colonial literature. For those of you who are interested in post-colonial literature studies, and best practices in teaching and learning in the humanities, and has been published in refereed journals and books. Throughout her career, Prof Ann has earned more than a dozen awards and grants for her work in the humanities, community-based learning, humanities research, and curricular innovation. Dr. Fallon is also supporting program directors of two recently awarded NEH grants at Fisher, NEH Humanities Initiatives and NEH Connections. In addition, she is currently serving as the STEM administrator for a National Science Foundation STEM grant and is the co-PI on a TEAGLE planning grant on citizenship. Prof Ann, I'm so happy to have you here. Some of these activities that you're involved in also interest us a lot, especially students, especially learning, innovative learning, community learning. This is also what some of our students do with the stateless communities, which Prof Ann, you've also met in Sabah, I believe, on their last visit. Yeah. So thank you so much, Ann, for joining us today. I have, with that, I will, yeah, the floor is yours.
So exciting. All right, I will open my presentation. So we'll hope it works. There we go. What's up there? See, look, oh, this is my first, we just practiced yesterday from learning Google Meet. There we go. All right, now I can see what you look like. Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Marshall Sanon for this invitation and for his friendship over the years. I had such a wonderful couple of visits to Malaysia, and I have really treasured my time there. I think about it a lot. I think about the wonderful conference that we were at, where I learned a huge amount about liberal education and really thinking about it from a completely different perspective. I've had the privilege of working in liberal arts and liberal education in the United States and in Europe, but in Malaysia, it looks very different in many ways, and yet very much the same as we explore very common questions in our humanities through our very different geographic lenses and our different spaces and occupations. So I am so privileged to be here today, and thank you again for the invitation and to speak to all of you. I really want to hear more about your experiences as well. So my goal today is to try to not lecture you for too long, but to give you some context for what we're facing, to hear more about what you're facing, and to really strategize together as we're thinking about what this future looks like. This is probably an image that is familiar to everyone. This is from our CDC online, but this is the novel SARS COVID-19 virus that has upended our worlds in spectacular ways and in many different contexts. And I think that we're seeing in many ways the acceleration of a lot of trends and also some of the moving backwards in certain areas as we think about how we're responding in an international and as a global community to this threat, and what it means as we have been isolated in our homes and our businesses and our schools really for the last year, a little over a year now, and thinking about what that means for intellectual connections and physical connections as we explore our history together. So I just wanted to start off today a little bit to set the stage, just to make sure we're all on an even playing field in understanding liberal arts and liberal arts education, particularly in the United States, which is what I am most familiar with. Although I've had the opportunity again to just visit and learn a little bit about the incredible work that you're doing out there in general studies and general education in your program. So in the United States, liberal arts education or liberal education really encompasses topics in the humanities, the sciences, the social sciences, and the arts. So we really ranging in the humanities from history and philosophy and religious studies and literature, where I have spent most of my life, to the physical sciences and the arts, to languages and mathematics. So really the broad array of courses that constitute education at a university and really have shaped how modern education has come about. So the United States has really been a leader in thinking about liberal arts education since the founding of Harvard, but really since the 19th century. And that particular model has been, we draw from a European tradition, and we've also adapted other traditions. And then you'll see in many parts of the world, either the US system or something from the British system, which is a really interesting topic in terms of how we think about colonization and the colonization of knowledge as well, expanding around the world. So we really trace back in many ways. You can trace the idea, some people will, of liberal arts education back to Socrates and the idea of Greek education and the Socratic method, when a bunch of Greeks were talking about ideas and threatening the status quo and thinking about what it meant to be a good citizen. But really the modern liberal arts, we kind of go back to Cambridge University in England and a little college called Emmanuel College that's located at Cambridge. And back in the 16th century, if we can imagine that far back, that was the college that was a little bit rebellious. So it was founded by Puritans as a dissenting college. And so this is a little bit, this is after the Henry VIII, if you know your history, and thinking about England now has a king who's the head of the church and the head of the state. And it really is upending how people are imagining themselves in the world, because they're not looking to the Pope. They're really looking locally as they're thinking about religious education. They're thinking about translating the Bible into English, which had never been done before, and it had been done, but a lot of people got their tongues ripped off or had various other bodily issues when they were trying to reform the Catholic Church in England and in other places. And so this little college gets founded, and it's really quite radical at the time. So even though it's puritanical, which we think of as pretty stodgy when we think about the Puritans in the US, it was also a very active intellectual entity. And so one of the guys who went there, his name was Harvard. He heads over to England and he donates his library heads over to the US and donates his library to what then became Harvard College or Harvard University, which is the first college in the United States. And so Harvard is a seminary at first. So it's where people go to learn religious studies, but they're also, in addition to Latin, they're learning theology, they're talking about philosophy, And it really becomes this, this first place where we're really thinking about in the United States, what does it mean to be an educated person? And in the US, we have, of course, this history of a revolution in the late 18th century, and people are really trying to come to grips with the notion of what it means to be a citizen. And what does it mean to rule yourselves instead of being ruled by this king that we were, we sort of got liberated from the Pope, perhaps is one way to think about it. And people are thinking about what does it mean to be free thinking. And then as they're thinking about a revolution or a democracy, really becomes about, well, what does it mean to be a citizen? And then a lot of anxiety, especially around white men who own property, about who gets to vote and what do you really need to know in order to vote. So you have to have property, you have to be white, you have to be educated. You don't just want the masses to be voting, because there's a huge anxiety that uneducated people will take over the democracy and you'll have mob rule. So there's a lot of fear of that. So education in some ways is established as kind of the bulwark against that. We need an educated citizenry. And then, as you can imagine, there's a lot of debates about, well, what does it mean to be an educated citizenry? What do we need to know in order to vote on our own destiny? And so we really see in the beginning of the 19th century a huge proliferation of colleges and an idea of what it would mean to be a citizen. So Thomas Jefferson, who's the third president of the United States, starts the first public college, which is the University of Virginia, where I had the privilege of going. And the idea is that you were making a public institution that where people can go. Now, public for Thomas Jefferson meant white men who come from relatively wealthy backgrounds would have a place to go to college and study. And all of the stories indicate that throughout the 19th century, UVA, University of Virginia, was quite the party school. These young men went to have, I'm sure they were very serious about their studies, but there was a lot of famous drinking that happened on the campus. And a lot of then introspection about what does it really mean to train these young men to be citizens and politicians in this country. So the Yale report happened. So Yale University is a private institution. It was a rival of Harvard's that came up in Connecticut, and happens, gets founded. And there's this report that comes out in 1828. So this is a little bit after University of Virginia is founded. It's at the beginning of these proliferation of this debates around education. And so something called the Yale report comes out, a bunch of faculty get together and they say the ideal education is not to train someone for an individual profession. So we're not just training accountants or for the military or even a vocation as a clergyman, which is a very common educational goal for going to college in the 18th and 19th century, or to be an attorney, but to really train mostly young men at the time to teach I love this quote, our object is not to teach what is peculiar to any one of the professions, but to lay the foundation which is common to them all. This is really a strong principle that we see threaded all the way through 2021, when we have debates and conversations about liberal education and liberal arts education. The idea fundamentally is that we're not training someone to pick up a job as an accountant or even as an attorney, that we're really training people, young people especially, is sort of the idea, to live a whole life, to be educated enough to train for any profession, to be able to be critical thinkers, and to be, for the 19th century and continuing on, good citizens, and to really be participants in a democracy. So very early on in the United States, as people are getting ready to be citizens and thinking about what that means to be a good citizen, people were already talking about who gets access to that. So there were huge debates around early on, African-American votes, women voting, Mexican Americans or Hispanic votes, votes for people who are impoverished? Do you get to immigration? Is a big conversation early on. And so pretty early in the 19th century, as these colleges are springing up that are really serving young white men from fairly privileged backgrounds, a lot of organizations come up in nonprofit, especially churches, that really advocate for, well, it's a democracy, so everybody needs to be educated to participate. And the best education from certain of these groups, right, is a liberal arts education. So then you get, and to me, I think this is a really beautiful part about American history, some really wonderful small colleges that spring up, dedicated to providing access to liberal education and liberal arts education for all. So you start to see the rise of women's colleges, colleges that are just devoted to primarily white women. You see colleges that come up that are devoted just to African American women. You have colleges that come up that are devoted early on, before the Civil War, to Black and white students. You have colleges that that cater to particular religious groups that have been persecuted. You have colleges that cater to Jewish students. And so really this sense of the college, and particularly liberal arts education, is going to be a key factor in being able to participate in the democracy. But of course, all is not sunshine and roses in this world. And there's strong debates that also emerge between technical or vocational education and liberal arts or liberal education. So we see this most clearly in these very public debates between two really important African-American intellectuals in the 19th century, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Booker T. Washington argued very strongly that African Americans really needed technical or vocational training in order to be successful in the United States, to have careers, to be able to support their families, to be good citizens. They needed to learn a vocation, a strong technical skill, and to be successful in that, and to really wait for freedom. That was a big piece of it, and in terms of gradual emancipation. W.E. Du Bois he was able to go to Germany and earned his PhD. He was a philosopher. He wrote many, many things, but among them was The Souls of Black Folk. And his argument, and a synopsis of that would be that everybody deserves access to liberal arts education, and that to restrict African Americans to technical or vocational skills was really undermining their intellectual capacity and creating a situation where they were really destined to forever be second-class citizens, not to have access to the true educational opportunities that liberal arts provides, the understanding of language, history, literature. Well, Booker T. Washington felt that was really a waste of time. W.E.B. Du Bois strongly argued that is the essence of what it means to be free. So this was a huge debate in the 19th century. There are historic Black colleges that are founded. Some of them are really very much focused on technical or vocation, and others come to be focused around the liberal arts. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but I think that really sets out the stakes of the debate. And the same held true for women. There are women's colleges that come up that are just focused towards Simmons College in Boston is a great example. It was really meant to train seamstresses working in. John Simmons was a very wealthy merchant. He had a lot of money. He felt like his seamstresses needed to be better trained in order to be teachers and nurses. And so he created a vocational college, and then actually decided that they needed a stronger liberal arts training in order to be better professionals and better workers in his factory. So there's really this quite rich history of liberal arts colleges that moves through the 20th century. So today there is about 5,000 colleges and universities in the United States, and 228 of those roughly are liberal arts colleges, and those have a student body of less than 2,000, like the place that I work now. But liberal arts education is really broadly adopted across most research institutions. So Harvard University is a great example. It started off as a college, and today it is a major research institution known around the world. But liberal arts and liberal education really remains at the core of its undergraduate offerings. So every undergraduate student has the opportunity and really the requirement to study across a broad range of fields, from literature to science to social sciences, to sociology and anthropology. So no one at Harvard as an undergraduate is just studying to be trained to be a single vocational profession. They really, again, as an undergraduate student, have broad training, and that is part of the signature of Harvard and something that is replicated across the country, and usually represented through what we call general education or liberal arts education or liberal arts requirements that are part of the undergraduate degree that is issued, and in the United States, usually around a 4-year degree. And this notion of a broad educational training, as I talked about in the beginning, is really central to this idea. And there's many iterations in thinking about innovation and research in the 21st century about learning, but that's kind of, the gist of the idea. So already before 2020, whereas you can imagine this, when you think about the history of this continuing debate and the acceleration of the economies and the changing technologies that we see in our lifetimes as we, have moved from, almost 50 years ago, there was just landlines and telephones. And today, of course, we have these computers that we walk around with in our pockets. So the acceleration of technology, the acceleration of climate change, really crisis around changing economic markets, because we see the economy quite, from 2008 moving up and down quite unsteadily. So there's a sense of angst and anxiety. In the United States, economic inequality has really, the gap between the wealthy and the poor has grown exponentially. So people at the bottom of the economic level have seen wages decline over the last 30 years as opposed to increasing. Life expectancy and certain populations has gone down in the United States over the last few years. So there's really been some demographic markers of an increasing inequality among the population. And some of that also is reflected in the lack of access to. So there's only 228 liberal arts colleges in the United States, whereas there are 5,000 colleges, most of whom have a general education or liberal arts piece to their degree, but a smaller and smaller portion of that undergraduate degree. It's very expensive to offer liberal arts education. Ideally, in a liberal arts environment, you have small classes, you have the opportunity for practicing the Socratic method around discussions. It's really an emphasis around the relationship between the faculty or the teacher and the students, and the ability of the students to have a conversation as they're exploring a variety of subjects and opportunities. And it's expensive to train people to get PhDs, and it's expensive to have those PhDs teach relatively small classes. Those are fixed prices. You can't get more efficient in many ways. And then there are these continuing debates about what is the value of the liberal arts education, and that very early conversation in the 19th century between vocational or technical education and how important a part of that is in a modern economy versus a liberal arts education and how critical that is in a modern economy. And that debate continues to be very much felt, highly felt. Only about 30% of people in the United States get bachelor's degrees, so it's still a minority of the population. So there's also a huge question of access. The price of liberal arts colleges and all universities and colleges is quite eye-watering. It's very expensive to offer this kind of an education. And a lot of the supports for that education has declined. So more and more of the cost of that education falls to families, many of those families who are feeling more and more of an economic crunch. So the ability of students from lower incomes, students who have, and many of those students in lower incomes in the United States are from African-American families, from families of color. So access to education is really a huge concern. And then once people get to college, finishing college is a big deal, because you don't want to pay all the money to get there in your first year, only to leave after that first semester because you're unprepared or worried or unable to pay for the rest of the cost of the college education. And then the United States, what that generally means is your family might have taken out a big loan to go to college. You might start off in that first semester, and if things don't go well, sometimes students understandably feel a horrible sense of shame, concern, anxiety. They might drop out of college after hitting that first failure, that first tough class. And then they have debt. So now they have the debt for that first year, and they don't have a college degree to begin to pay that back. And it really creates a vicious cycle. So it's one of the things that systematically is problematic, and one of the things that I work on a lot in my own advocacy and in my own work at the college and the other colleges that I've been at. So already you have kind of a fragile ecosystem. You don't have a sustainable economic model. You have rising costs to offer the education. You really have a ceiling of how much one can charge families to have access to that education, and people's ability to pay back the debt that they're incurring is limited because of stagnant wages. So we've already got kind of the perfect storm of issues. And then in March 2020, as we all know, COVID hits really hard in the United States. And many colleges immediately close their doors and send students home for the safety of students. There's some really interesting reports around the world, right, of what happened to higher education in March 2020. Many universities, as I'm sure you all know, experienced closures, closed down, and tried to really scramble to just communicate with students to make sure students were safe, and then to try to figure out how to continue learning in this particular environment when we have relatively limited options, limited tools, when there's still an access gap in terms of access to the internet. And then there's a learning gap, right? So this is not necessarily the best educational environment to learn a lot, just to have someone like me come in and talk to a screen from halfway around the world or even around the block. So really trying to think strongly about, well, what happens to learning? And then what happens to learning in this trauma? So it's also looking at a lot of the studies and the level of anxiety that students are experiencing, the level of food insecurity, shelter insecurity. So if you're worried about a pandemic, if you're worried about your family, if you're worried about your health, then really your educational experience understandably takes a back seat. Suddenly the deadline to meet that essay or that finals quiz is just not that important. The other thing that happens in the United States in this very critical period is all of these colleges are out recruiting to get students to come in for the next fall, because every year you need a new group of students to come in so that you can offer your education, and so that students can pay the tuition, because this is an economy as well. And so this recruiting cycle of the ability for students to come and look at colleges and just see if that's even a place that they would want to go, and faculty and staff to go out and meet with students in the high schools to talk about what their interests are or what they want to study, all of that shuts down. So what we start to see coming towards the fall semester of fall 2020 is a lot of colleges really struggling to meet their enrollments, to have students show up on campus. And then a lot of colleges that still can't have students show up on campus, that campus is not a safe place. The dorms, as you all know, are quite crowded. It's really the ideal conditions for a pandemic. And so really trying to understand at a residential college, what does that mean if students can't be on campus? My daughter is in college. She's at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., but actually she's been in her college bedroom this whole year and a half down the hall, and she's studying from Washington, D.C. And I think we would also all agree that that is not the experience that one signed up for in the beginning. It also means economically that colleges have taken a huge hit. So the number of students that have come to pay tuition is lower. We make money on room and board when students show up. That's a huge part of the financial package that helps support colleges, and that money is not there. Or if people are coming back, we've densified campuses, so there's fewer students coming back, or students don't want to be back, understandably. So that's another revenue loss. So coming into the pandemic, there were estimates that liberal arts colleges and small colleges, about 15% of them, 10% of them were already on rocky footing. And so this particular crisis has really accelerated rockiness and that inability to really be on a sustainable economic grounds. Some colleges have started to close this last year. So some of these amazing colleges that I mentioned earlier in the 19th century that were really founded on these principles of democracy and access have had to shutter. Other colleges are not making a decision and awaiting really federal aid. So looking at the packages coming out of Washington, D.C. to see what kind of packages could come out to support colleges. But the number to support colleges is really quite astronomical when we think about losses, really in the billions of dollars. Faculty and staff who've been furloughed, meaning sort of temporarily let go of their jobs while they're considering what happens, as well as salary cuts. And then for our purposes, we think about the liberal arts, whole departments being shut down. And the first departments to get shut down in this kind of a crisis have all been in liberal arts or general education. So we've seen the loss of anthropology departments, literature departments, modern languages, international studies, political science, not unfortunately at our colleges, but that is a trend that's happening across the country. And so going back to those sort of original debates, when we talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, as people face this particular crisis, the thing that seems easiest to jettison is the liberal arts, and really moving in favor of an idea like, well, in a crisis, what we really need is STEM and technology and training. And so that has really come about as a very stark conversation to have. And a lot of questions are coming up. Is this going to accelerate the move towards STEM and technical education and vocational education? What does it mean to cut courses and majors and expertise? What does it even mean in terms of losing a whole generation of scholars? Some PhD programs have decided not to admit any more scholars coming into the fall of 2021. So a generation of scholarship starts to disappear. Because, of course, new people coming in, like yourselves coming in, can see new ideas, see things differently, move research forward in new ways. And so we risk intellectual stagnation as we don't train people coming up. And there's really no way in some ways to accelerate learning. We can accelerate it a little bit, but the human mind is what it is and does take time to train and grow and change. So I would like to argue, though, that things are not all doom and gloom, that COVID does not have to mean the acceleration or the end of liberal education. I think it gives us a really tremendous opportunity to really think about the dangers of not having a liberal education or a liberal arts education, and the limitations, really, of technical or vocational training. You really, in order to even battle COVID, being able to do the new vaccines, right, as they come out, is one area of expertise. But being able to distribute vaccines across the world, being able to think about the ethics of vaccination, being able to provide access to elderly, to children, to the vulnerable, to everyone, to a life-saving vaccine, are all skills that come not from technical education, but from the liberal arts. So in many ways, we've started to see the renaissance of the idea and the debates back in the papers, rather than just taking it for granted that technical or vocational education is the wave of the future. Real pushback from policymakers, academics, students, and families that the value of liberal arts and liberal education is not to be overlooked, that it does provide key areas of access, that back to this W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker conversation, that really to condemn people to merely technical or vocational education is really to deprive people of the ability to fully realize their own human powers, to fully realize who they are in the world as democratic citizens, able to realize their full potential and their full human rights and blossoming. So that's a little bit of the background that I wanted to offer for us this evening, and I would be more than happy and delighted to have conversations. Professor Marshall writes extensively and much more profoundly on the issues of liberal education, and I would love to know more about what's happening in terms of trends that you're seeing on the ground. So thank you so much for letting me share this evening, and I'll go back to the screen. Maybe I'll even stop.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Prof Ann. I really enjoyed the talk. I could see, because as some of you might know, I've worked in marketing of education programs, so I can see the huge problems that would happen to anyone who was working for the university, trying to promote the university and make the university survive in this extremely challenging environment. Yeah, Prof Ann has so kindly allowed me to. We agreed on this, that I would be able to use a fair amount of Malay, even though it might a fair amount of Malay to explain to some of our students who are here some of the top main points that were discussed during the discussion. Pelajar-pelajar saya ya, daripada rasa ramai daripada hak asasi manusia hari ini ada di sini. Adakah boleh saya dengar suara siapa-siapa daripada ini?
Hi sir.
Hi sir.
Hi, sir.
Hello sir.
Hi sir.
Mungkin boleh ucapkan selamat pagi juga kepada Pak Mentan.
Good evening, Prof.
Good evening, Prof.
That's
Good
you.
evening.
That's you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Prof.
Good evening,
Hello,
Prof.
Prof. Hello.
And we have
Hello.
Kennedy, Saidatul, Jamsari, and others from our department as well, from the liberal arts department in our university. So apa yang saya mungkin kalau ini tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, kalau tengok chat tadi, saya harap anda dapat tengok chat tadi. Saya telah memberi sedikit penjelasan ya tentang dalam bahasa Melayu apa yang telah berlaku, apa yang Prof Ann telah membincangkan pada kita ya. Dan pendek cerita ya, kalau mau tadi ada nampak chat kah? Ada beri perhatian pada chat kah semasa saya menulis terjemahan?
Ada sir, ada.
Ya sir.
Ada.
So yeah, so if you have been watching the chat, so you see my Malay translation, I think you get the idea what is happening. It's a really important issue. It's a really important issue. Kenapa? Because you and I, okay, you see pensyarah pun boleh dijadikan ini penganggur. So even a lecturer can become, the University of Malaysia Sabah can tell me tomorrow, okay, Saran, we don't need liberal arts anymore. Okay, please go and find another job. Go and find another job, and maybe, and if you have a job in the US, maybe I can apply, put in an application. So because you know this thing called STEM. So I hope those of you in Malaysia are following this trend. This trend called STEM: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Yeah. So dalam masa krisis, apakah yang kita mau buat? Ya, kebanyakan subjek-subjek macam sejarah boleh buang, sastra boleh buang. Ya. So apa yang mereka mau tumpukan, mau jimatkan kos, mereka tumpukan kepada science, mathematics, engineering, dan apa tu tadi and technology. So yang pendidikan liberal, pendidikan luas tentang nilai-nilai moral, moral values. What happens to all our discussions on nation building, good citizenship, kewarganegaraan? We stress this topic in our course. Modern citizenship. The idea of being equal, whether you're black, you're a woman, or you're from a poor background or a rich background. This idea of equality, which is very important in modern citizenship. Dan tadi Prof Ann pun ada cerita tentang perubahan masyarakat Eropah dari zaman King Henry VIII, zaman raja-raja di Eropah, zaman pihak agama yang memerintah Eropah kepada zaman di mana ada kebebasan, to an era in the 19th century when you have freedom to get educated. People were thinking about, and not just the government, the people who were in what we might call today as NGOs, the church organizations, the civil society organizations, semua yang berminat untuk melibatkan diri dalam pendidikan untuk memastikan bahawa pendidikan sampai pada semua orang, bukan saja lelaki kulit putih, yang pada awalnya mereka saja yang mendapat pendidikan, but from white. Would it be fair to say, Anne, that it was mainly a white male thing, education at the beginning of the 19th century?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, to expansion to Native Americans, blacks, women, and other historical minorities.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Mostly like NGOs and churches to have that access.
Yeah. Then and Prof Ann also talked about how it is being challenged today by the not just by the modern economic environment where everything is money. Science for money, technology for money, engineering for money. It's been challenged by also the recent crisis where if you have a crisis, what do you want to continue liberal arts? These are the reasons why college di Amerika Syarikat, college Amerika Syarikat gulung tikar, satu demi satu mereka gulung tikar oleh kerana kehilangan sumber pendapatan, bukan saja daripada yuran tetapi penginapan, oleh kerana people don't come and stay, they don't come and stay in the colleges anymore, so they don't pay the fees for staying at the college. And so colleges are losing their source of revenue from these traditional sources of revenue that they could get, closing down the college. Prof Ann and I were in the same university at one time in Portland, and that university doesn't exist. I'm going to write the name for you. You can Google it as well. It's called Marylhurst University. It is a liberal arts college of more than 100 years. I taught there as a Fulbright scholar, and now it is closed down. For economic reasons, because everybody wants in the modern environment, everybody is thinking about how they're going to pay back their student loans. Mereka mahu satu ijazah yang membolehkan mereka membayar balik pinjaman hutang pendidikan dan sebagainya. Okay. So I think I've dengan itulah yang tadi diceritakan oleh Prof Ann, dan sekarang saya menjemput tuan-tuan dan puan-puan. Okay, I invite you to the next stage of our discussion, which I'll hand over to Prof Ann.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm curious too about people's experience in general education. Do you hear from are you confused about why you take liberal education classes? And you're obviously not with Professor Marshall, but as you're thinking about your own education, do people understand why they're taking classes in political science or literature or the humanities from the student's perspective?
So you can answer in Malay or English. I'm more than happy to translate. So the question is, why are you taking gugusan pengajian liberal? Why are you? So are you confused? Are you any?
Not exactly confused. I think it's understandable because I think it's important to learn, especially when it comes to liberal arts education. Just like Prof Ann said, it kind of lays the foundation for our thinking and learning especially. So yeah, I don't think I'm confused. I think it's actually important.
And what are you studying for in your degree?
I'm studying psychology, child and family psychology.
Very nice. And what is your favorite class?
Favorite class?
Mm-hmm.
All of it or just in psychology?
Maybe your general education, any of it.
I actually enjoy my liberal education more. Like the elective, like universal human rights. I'm taking universal human rights and also language revitalization. So I enjoy it very much because it's kind of different from what I'm taking specifically, psychology. So yeah.
Yeah. Does it change the way you think about psychology at all?
Not really. I think it helps me even more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it helps me even more in kind of navigating through learning psychology because when I learned, for example, back in semester 1, I took gender and society, so I was able to see how this impacts like psychologically. And when I take universal human rights, I get to see how these rights kind of tie in with how people are socialized and then the psychological effects and all of that stuff. So it's fun.
Yes. I always find making those connections to be the most exciting part when you get to really see how ideas are in conversation with each other.
Definitely.
Now, how does your family feel about your education or thinking about liberal arts education versus psychology? Do they have any opinions?
Not really. I think mostly I feel pressured from because I was a STEM student, so a lot of people want me to continue in STEM, but I went for psychology instead. But other than that, they don't really have like strong opinions on what I should take and should not take. They're very supportive with what I plan on taking. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it that made you be able to switch from STEM to psychology when you, I assume, sort of fell in love with the topic?
I've actually been really interested in social sciences, humanities ever since I was young. But a lot of my grades, my grades throughout high school, throughout secondary school, have put me under science, and I love science too. But I'm more passionate about humanities and social sciences. So yeah, that's why I took psychology.
Nice. Well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad that you found something that you love and that you're able to make these connections and have this great education.
Thank you.
Now, how has for other people too, or for you as well, thinking about what has learning been like in this environment? This is something that's really interesting to me as well, and thinking about, okay, this is changing how we're teaching. We're doing a lot of classes where I'm at, where we do have the classroom set up. We have students in the classroom, about half of the people that could usually be in a classroom. The teacher stands at the front of the room with a mask on and a microphone and can't move around, which is the part I hate because I like to use my hands and walk around. And then there's students that are on the Zoom screen or on the Zoom. And we all hate that because we can't talk to the students that are online. It's hard to talk to the students in front of you. I can't wander around and talk with people. So it changes the way we teach. But I'm thinking about, how has it changed? Are people thinking about how it's changing the way that you learn? The studies are telling us that students are very anxious. So the anxiety level has just gone through the roof. And when people are really anxious, their frontal critical thinking skills go way down, and we get a lot of swelling back in our primal brain. So I'm wondering if people are feeling, is the studying different? Are you learning things differently? How are you applying your learning? It's always so, like for me, I just am used to calling students out in a classroom, right? So I can see them, and poor anyone that looks at me, if they look at me cross-eyed, I was like, oh, you look like you have a question. But on Zoom or on these channels, it's much harder to do.
Hello, if I may. Hi.
Please, hi.
Hi, it's so great to meet you. I feel since you mentioned, Prof, about how it's changed, how the learning environment has changed. For me, I am fortunate enough to be back on campus because the majority of the courses right now at our university, they're still offering classes online. And while I do have classes online, I'm taking, similar to Amir, I'm also taking psychology, but particularly counseling psychology. So we have our practicum.
Nice.
Yeah, we're having our practicum right now. So I'm actually back on campus conducting counseling sessions. So there is that physical element to our studies, which I do appreciate because we are now back on campus because we have to carry out our practicum. So I am grateful for it. But it has greatly changed because we're so used to seeing so many people on campus, but now we cannot. And reaching out to people and asking other students to come join us for counseling sessions, it's not easy because there aren't a lot of people around on campus. It's still pretty much empty and not a lot of people want to come for counseling sessions because people are worried that they might contract COVID-19. It's worrying, and we are also we've also just came out of our quarantine because there were cases on campus, and there are still people who don't want to come to counseling sessions. So I think that has been the biggest change for me during COVID-19. We didn't expect this to happen, but that's something we just have to cope with right now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so great that you talk about that too. Like we've seen pre-COVID, there were a lot of, I would say mostly in the popular press, like, oh, it's the end of residential experiences. Students just want to take, I don't know if people remember the MOOCs, this idea that you would just take online classes all the time and that would be better than taking in-person classes. So I think the other very hopeful thing about COVID is people have seen how valuable the experience is of being in person on a residential campus, seeing other people, that it's really quite difficult to learn all by yourself in your study at night alone. That really a lot of learning that takes place is in community with other people in conversation.
Exactly, yeah.
So are other people finding that the isolation in terms of how that's impacting your learning? I mean, we talk abstractly in liberal arts about like what we want to learn is engagement and connection and the play of ideas, right? So that you can challenge one another and question one another and learn from one another. Are people feeling that absence, or are you feeling like you get that in this virtual environment?
Yeah, maybe if I could share from a educator's perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I mean, at first, of course, it's really difficult because there's so much that you lose by not seeing the students' faces, and I would say, I was just beginning to, the more you practice, the better you get at question and answer sessions with students. So I was just getting better at it, and then I had to restart relearn my skills, with the students when I come back, when we come back to the halls of lecture halls, when when you come back. Saya tahu, Prof Ann tanya sama ada kamu you faham bahwa kita buat soal jawab online, tetapi you rasa apa-apa kekangan ataupun kekurangan dari segi tidak boleh bersemuka, soal jawab itu terasa palsu kah, terasa pelik kah, oleh kerana saya tanya you perlu tunggu 10 saat baru dengar suara saya. Mungkin boleh bagi tahu Prof Ann tentang suasana pembelajaran dalam online berbanding dalam dewan kuliah.
Okay, I want to give my point of view for the learning online. I think learning online is quite hard for me because I can't really understand what the lecturer say, especially when comes to the internet connection. For example, I'm taking a STEM degree like engineering, so it's hard for me to understand the formula or the equation that been explained. And for people, when the lecturer asking question to a student, uh, I have a mindset that is there will other people answering this question, and I scared if my question um is what we call it when I want to talk and other people also want to talk, so I scared that my lecturer cannot understand what I am talking. Like I want to say it's hard when I also feel shy, although I not seeing other people online. But uh, do you understand? I'm sorry, but I cannot really speak English.
No, I absolutely understand. I think you did very well. It's hard to it's hard to speak up in class, period, sometimes, but particularly online when you don't have that human connection, you know, it's hard, but you can't see the expression on someone's face,
Yeah,
to really understand.
especially when asking lecturer. For example, if the lecturer don't open the camera, so I'm scared if the question that I'm asked make the lecturer feel uh what we call that. The question is not suitable in the class because I cannot see the reaction of the lecturer.
Right. So you're
So
like, oh, was that a stupid
yeah,
question? I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know.
And
Like,
I scared if other people thinking that what kind of question that are you asking for? It's like a common question. It's like I feel
right.
insecure. That thing, that word. I feel insecure in class, although
I
it's
mean, I think
online.
that's very understandable. I mean, it's hard to take lecture. It's hard, in person even, but to be online and to not have any human connection really, except one's voice,
Yeah,
is
feeling awkward.
quite intimidating. I mean, I think that one of the things too that I've been thinking about a lot this year is how much learning is about relationships. It's we can get any amount of information or data. You could look up W.E.D. Du Bois. You don't need me to tell you about his life, but it's the relationships, right, that we have with people that really is transformative. And part of I think the biggest part of an education is being able to know someone as a student and then to see that fire in them, to see that gift in them. Like that's, when we're at our best as teachers, it's when we really see something in someone and can see that quizzical look and then help, both to clarify that and then also to see what's so special about you and to understand your own gifts that you're bringing to the table as you're learning. I think there's this fabulous idea that I've learned this year that I also feel kind of stupid that I didn't know the word before, but it's called threshold knowledge. And threshold knowledge is something that once you've learned it, you can't unlearn it, and it changes the way you perceive everything. So learning to read is a great example of threshold knowledge. Like once you learn to read, unless you have a brain injury or something, catastrophic, like you always know how to read. And the script on the page is meaningful then, right? Like you can't unlearn to read. And so I feel like the threshold knowledge that I have come through as we're all moving through this threshold, right? Things are going to look very different on the other side, and the way we perceive things are going to be just different. And I think for me, the threshold knowledge has been about that relationship. Like education is not about knowledge that I bring to the table. It's not even really about 8 years that I studied post-colonial literature. It's about 50 years of trying to understand people and build relationships and build those connections. And then in the practice of teaching, really be able to try to get to know a student and try to help them really develop themselves. And really for me, then become a learner as well and understand what a student has to teach me, because all of those relationships are about learning. And learning is hard.
Saya ada pertanyaan.
Yes, hello.
Ya, teruskan,
Hello.
teruskan.
Saya ingin bertanya tentang pendapat Prof Ann. Adakah pendidikan liberal ni dapat membentuk karakter individu itu sendiri?
Does the liberal education facilitate the creation of the building of character, the building of one's own character?
I believe that to be true. Yes. I think that it is, it's traditionally been developed, and I think anybody can come back for an education, but traditionally it's been developed for 18-year-olds. And 18-year-olds, your brain is still growing, your brain is maturing. I would like to think my brain is still growing and maturing, but we know until age 25. And so part of that educational experience at 18, 19, 20, 21, I think there's a huge responsibility as we see students really in this transformative post-adolescent, early adulthood stage in development. It isn't just about understanding knowledge, but really understanding and building how you apply that knowledge to your own life. There's actually several studies too that point to students who have a strong liberal arts education actually lead happier lives. So they've done these interviews with people, and I'm not a psychologist or sociologist, but I get to talk to a lot of them in my job. And people with bachelor's degrees, at least with a liberal arts background, have happier lives when they're 30s and 40s and 50s because they've had this chance, we would argue, and people talk about, to really reflect on their decisions, to really think about shaping their own goals. So they're not just the victim of like various catastrophes or crises, but they really have some power over their own experience. And to be empowered really is to have some shape over your own life and to be able to fill in your own narrative and to be able to articulate your own character. So I think, and also, especially in the United States, when we saw really the foundation of liberal arts colleges was developed by religious organizations and nonprofits, these NGOs, was really very much about a strong belief that this was shaping people's characters, and again, what it meant to be free, really, and to live it and to make our decisions and to make good decisions.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Hi, Prof. I have a question.
Yes.
In your opinion, is liberal education still relevant in this day? Because for me, it's kind of disturbing because you're just not attending the class, but they also give you a lot of assignment to do instead of your main course.
Yes. So, I'm very passionate and prejudiced on this point, but I do think that it is critical. I think that liberal education is probably one of the most important pieces of the education that you get because it helps you understand how to go out and find knowledge. So, because you really can't just Google an answer and have a complete answer, you have to really be able to understand what search terms to use, what's a credible source, who are these people that are giving you alternating opinions. If even looking at a mathematical formula, how do you really break down that formula and apply it? How do you think about the right problem solving skills that you need to take? So I would very much argue that what you get in a liberal education course, in a series of courses, is really this ability to bring other skills to problem solving. That what we're really teaching you is logic and problem solving, how to look at the correct sources, how to think ethically, to go back to the character question, and how to think about your own thinking processes as you're moving forward. It just reminds me, as we were talking, I think the best professor that I've ever seen at work in my career was a teacher that I had at Swarthmore College. So Swarthmore was where I did my undergraduate degree, and it was founded by not by Puritans, but by Quakers. and it was founded in right in the Civil War, and it was founded as a peace college. So it had immediately was open to both men and women, which was unusual, and whites and blacks, also unusual. And the idea was that you were coming to be educated and be educated as a whole person. So it was Quakers were quite radical in their day. And Swarthmore was in Pennsylvania, very close to the Mason-Dixon line, very close to some of the major battlefields of the war. So people really felt that civil unrest in a very deep way, and how critical it was to rebuild a nation who was really at war with itself. So the best professor that I had there, he could sit in a room and he could have 10 or 15 students in the room. So again, very small. And he did have an idea for the class. We had a whole bunch of readings that we had to do, but he would spend, and we would have these long sessions of 4 hours, and he could draw out of each student the genuine questions that they had. So to go back to Jasmina's question, like there were no stupid questions, because you just really could feel like you could ask anything, because he had that kind of demeanor. And then he could build in that conversation, answer your question, but really in a conversational tone, and then invite the next person to contribute. And that skill of being able to suss out the real question behind the question that someone's asking, to make a connection to the next person, to watch an argument being built around a room over 2 or 3 hours with a bunch of different people from different perspectives. That's such a huge skill that's not just applicable to understanding. That class happened to be Latin American politics, but that's a skill that I have striven my whole life to try to master, because I use it all the time. I'm a dean and an administrator, so I get to do some lecturing and I get to do some teaching, but most of what I do is trend analysis, going through Excel, and really the biggest piece of what I do is build relationships among people to solve really hard questions about how we rebuild an economy, about how we think about about humanities, about how we bring in students and teach them how to be, we hope, great citizens, and draw out, not even just teach them, but help them draw out their own resources. And those are the skills that I have gotten from liberal arts educations, and that I continue to apply to my own life. It's like with all of the other education that I've had the opportunity, and really vocational education and teaching that I've had after that. But it was that foundation for me that I think has been really critical in my own ability to function in the world, because those are the skills that really allowed me to know, well, okay, this is what I need to read, and this is the kind of question that I need to ask to really get to the heart of this. And this is the kind of evidence that I need to marshal an argument, to go in front of a board, to argue for more resources for our science programs. So I would say the technical skills are difficult and hard, the memorization, the problem solving that you get in your major courses. But to really take seriously the relationship, the analytical problem solving, the communication skills that you're getting in your liberal education courses are really quite foundational. And the reason that you take them is because there is this 350-year-old history, at the very least, of research behind it that tells us that this is really how you can really excel in your other coursework.
And maybe about Intan's point about she's getting too much work in her liberal arts course as opposed to main courses, which she. So how do we solve this problem?
What kind of work are you assigning, Simon? Are you assigning too much?
I give, this is the thing, right? The university has moved towards outcome-based learning. And in outcome-based learning, everything, it's all about what the students submit to you, because we have classes of 100, and if I ask them to, if I try and mark them on their responses, their responses to me during lectures, I won't have enough tutors to track what the responses are. So it can't be finished in the lecture. So in people like students like Intan have to take work home, so resubmit it to me sometimes online when they can't get online on top of it in the pandemic, everything is online. So they themselves are wondering why I have to take, if I'm from engineering, why I have to waste so much time on learning human rights. Yeah?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that because what you learn in the classroom is really affected what you actually learn. So, and I actually think this is why residential experience is so critical. So you're learning something, and something very critical from Professor Marshall in his classroom as he's lecturing, and you're taking notes and you're thinking about it. And then you're going home and you're doing, I hope some good writing about it, because it's actually in the act of writing that you learn more, right? You learn a little bit in listening. That's like you'll probably remember, if I'm lucky, out of this whole talk, by tomorrow morning, maybe you'll remember 5 things, 5 minutes worth of things that I said. You're not going to remember a lot. And it's not because I'm not incredibly memorable, obviously, but that's just the way the human brain works. But if I assigned something, if I told you to go write for me about Booker T. Washington, or I gave you an assignment about W.E.B. Du Bois, or I gave you something on the Yale report and I asked you to go home and write about it for me and write in your own words, that act of writing about it and then maybe even talking about it with someone else means that you're going to learn not just like the name W.E.B. Du Bois, but you're going to learn something that you're going to it's going to internalize, and it's going to go past your short-term memory that lasts about 15 or 20 minutes, and it's going to start to shift over into your long-term memory. And the practice of me talking and you writing something down and then you having your own opinion about it is going to exponentially increase that learning. So the whole point is not just to create paperwork. So Sanan doesn't just want to say something for you to say it back to him to see how great your handwriting is. Really, it's about that's the learning process. And that learning process of taking information in and processing it through the act of writing, which has a tremendous neuroscience, and physically writing is even better than typing. In terms of being able to integrate that information. And it's, again, not even about integrating that particular piece of information. I mean, I do think that everybody should know about W.E.B. Du Bois because he's a phenomenal person, but really about integrating the idea of creating your own opinion from evidence. So it becomes a very integral part of who you are, and that practice of being able to take in information, add your own opinion, create an analysis, analyze the evidence, and give that back and present it back. That's the skill that we're teaching in general education. And it's not something that you can pick. It's not as easy, I put that in quotes, as learning math proof or memorizing a physics problem. It takes a lot of practice. It's not something that you just get in a few minutes. So, by the time that you're 4 years in and you have the chance to do an oral exam, you're a lot better at it than you are when you came in, that first year. Hopefully you're a lot better at it, and you're better at it because you had a lot of chances to practice, and you had chances to practice and someone give you feedback on that practice itself. Because it's not enough to just write it in your diary for yourself, right? And just write little notes to yourself and put it to the side. That's just one thing, but you really need someone to give you feedback on that. Oh, where you're thinking really went astray over there, so that when you do it the next time, you really have a chance to improve your thinking skills and really improve how you're pulling evidence together. And so unfortunately, that just takes a lot of work. I wish there was a shortcut for that for you, but it just takes time.
We have a student who is online, whose microphone is not working that well. Nur Shuhada, it's on the chat in Malay. What do you think, Prof, about students who are taking courses which they are not really interested in, but because of their parents or because, and now they are in the process of online study in the new normal? How do we practically how do you practically deal with the situation? I'm not interested in not really interested in the course, but because of my parents' aspirations, I take the course. On top of that, I have this new social distancing problem now, and I can't even interact and get the university experience.
Yes. No, that's terrible is what I just want to say at first. That is really hard. I wish I had an instant answer for you because that is just incredibly hard to do. So you've got all of the resistance of not wanting to do something that's boring or not interesting or not part of your everyday life. It's kind of foreign. There's all kinds of things that could make a topic unengaging, right? And then you don't have anyone around to reinforce that it's fun and interesting. You just have sort of this punitive, you must do it. It's a requirement. You must do this level of study. So that's a terrible answer for you because I wish that I had a better, neater way to tie that up. I think for me, it's about finding that kernel of curiosity, right? So when I think about my own life or I think about my students, I get curious about stuff. So, and that's how I find my way into things. So I'm like, well, why is this course so boring to me? And I know that's a really kind of ridiculous way to start, but like really trying to understand, like, what is it that I'm not interested in? Why does this not sparking a passion for me? Is it the monotone voice of the faculty? Is it really this text that we're reading that's boring for me? Does it not seem relevant to my own life? Is there someone that I could find even online in the internet who is doing this work that's interesting? Is there another way to get in? And then we just need to get a vaccine and go back to campus.
Nushada, pada hakikatnya itu masalah lah. Itu memang inilah. Nushada, saya faham juga soalan Anda. Ramai pelajar menghadapi masalah ini ya. Saya rasa di seluruh Malaysia ya. I think and this is a common problem in Malaysia ya. I think if not all over the world ya, that we've told everyone that you must have a degree, and degrees are not that diverse in Malaysia. They're not diverse enough in Malaysia, because our liberal education, our broad-based education system is not very developed. We got maybe 12 courses which you can choose from in one sector. Okay, so the students don't get to have a broad foundation before they focus on something.
No, you really you lose that that exploration. I mean, I think that's what's really powerful and very expensive, right? So we have a lot of our courses. So it's this is a small college where I'm at. We have about 4,000 students total, about 1,000 majors, but every semester we have 500 or 600 classes that you can choose from. So there's this wide variety of electives that you can decide, like, I could take a class in Irish history, or I could take a class in actually one of our most popular classes now is an online class on happiness. So it's in our psychology department, and there's not enough sections of it. There's wait lists for it. People are desperate to take it. Who doesn't want to know about happiness at this point in time? So, I think that is really the beauty of a broad liberal education, is really this choice, right? So you have to, even though we know these skills can be taught in almost any context, you have to be interested in the context to really be able to dig in.
I think that's what we fail to give our students. We from the school time as well, right from school, we tell them this we dictate knowledge to them, and then at the university level we try to encourage them to ask why should I learn this, but it's a bit late, right? So we tell them, like, okay, now you ask me why I'm supposed to learn this, and I'll answer it. But if for 10 years they've not been given the freedom to ask why is this important, the question, maybe I don't know, maybe maybe it doesn't occur when they come to university level. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, no, and there's always, and then even at university, even for us, right? Like we think, and we're whatever, however old we are, looking back, we're like, okay, our class is the most important class. Everybody should have to read Robinson Crusoe before they can go on in the world. And, we come with our own lenses, and we come from a different generation and a different perspective. And so I think, always trying to bridge that of like, what do we know that we think is valuable, and how do we actually make that connection to another generation? I also think, one of the things we've been trying to do in thinking about innovation in our general education program is we have topics. We have a new general education program we're launching, and it starts off in your first year, and you take classes all the way till your senior year. So you're taking your major classes along with your liberal arts education all the way through, so that you're not just doing it and getting it out of the way, but you're like constantly sort of having this support of a liberal education along the way. And then in the senior year, everybody does a project with students from other majors, because it doesn't have a prereq to it, that's on a community issue or a community problem. And so, and a topic. And so we're actually asking students to help us pick those topics. So to really get the students, like, what are the big questions that students have? Because that's really the whole point of university, is to ask these big questions. And, we messed things up. You guys are going to have to solve it. So we really would like to hear what questions that you have, so you can get started on that before we get too old.
And if you look at your chat, there's a question from Shirley.
Oh, I think it really depends. I think that oftentimes, yes. So about 30% of our students go on to graduate schools in one or 2 years. So they have 1 or 2 years in more specialized training. But I would also say, at least in the United States, that we're also seeing people are changing careers 5 or 6 or 7 times are the predictions. And so you might have to go back for training in each of those times, right? Like, you don't just get one educational shot and then you get a nice job and you stay there for 40 years. Like, that just doesn't happen in the world anymore. And so each time you need to retrain, the idea of the liberal arts is that you have this broad base of knowledge, and then as you train for these new skills, then you're able to apply this information and learn quickly and be able to move into this next career opportunity. So yes, I do think that there's ongoing education.
Yes. Yes, we can take a couple of more questions. I think there's one more, Anne. There's 2 more, actually. 1 or 2 more in the chat.
Let's see. I have a question. My friend's currently studying in Boston. We'd always have conversation regarding issues faced during the pandemic, and most issues we see right now are not new. Systematic issues, like you mentioned. Can we rise to the challenge of addressing these issues? How can we? I was going to say, if it's a yes/no question, I can say absolutely yes. We can do it, because I'm an optimistic person. I think there are a lot of great resources in academia to address the challenge of these issues. And I think one of the things that I've been reading about a lot in different articles is how urgent this question of access is today. And I think in many ways, one of the things we're doing, so this is an easy one, but we have in the United States historically Black colleges, and then we're also naming these are historically white colleges. If it's a historically white college, what is our responsibility as like understanding that history and that privilege of where we are, and learning from our mistakes and our own privilege in order to think about greater access. So instead of putting all of the burden on African American students to teach white students or to teach white faculty what it means about privilege, really understanding privilege for oneself, and talk about a threshold knowledge to really understand your own privilege in the world, and then your responsibility that goes with that, which is not about guilt, which isn't that useful. It's a process that one goes through, but really about, okay, like I am where I am in this system because of a lot of privileges that I have had that are just systematic. I didn't do anything to earn them. They just happened. And so, but what can I do to make sure that other people have opportunities, that the system opens up? And I think the very first step for that opening is for people to understand the systematic case of it, to not, a lot of the studies indicate that we feel things so, it's very easy to be defensive at first, right? Like, oh, like we've tried so hard as a college to be, and it's not our fault, and we didn't intend it, or, we as a white person didn't intend this. And it doesn't, like, that's a first step, that defensiveness, but that doesn't solve any of the issues. So being able to really understand the systems that got us all here are the way that we undo those systems. Because it isn't anyone. If it was one person, that would be so easy. Like, it's not one person, it's all of us together. And so that's how we start to undo systems. And there really are policy things that can make a big difference. The structural issues are not, we created them so we can uncreate them. And it's not one person, but it is a whole system. And since it took, it took a couple hundred years to create this system, but now we know better. So hopefully it will take less than a couple hundred years to undo the system and create a new system. And we're good thinkers. We know what works. So there are really important pieces of legislation in the new Biden legislation that would really help a lot of these access issues. And I think people are taking these conversations so much more seriously right now than they ever had. So when a lot of people were just denying that there was a problem or a lack of access, or that the access was some individual's fault, there was no way to solve the problem. But now that there's an acknowledgement of a problem, I was like, all right, now we can get busy and start fixing it. Why do I feel like, is this the next one? I have to move up. Ooh. Oh, look, I can go back down. Why do I feel like time is not on our side? I feel the burnout because I'm chasing deadlines for my major classes and also my liberal education. And also you're in a pandemic and a global crisis, and it's exhausting. We ask our students in one class, if anyone had experienced a panic attack or an anxiety attack, and usually it's a psychology class, so there was a context for this. And usually, maybe 5 students would raise their hand. We've been asking that question, and every single student has been raising their hand. Like, the level of anxiety that all of you are feeling is huge and real, and panic is hard, and burnout is real. I mean, these kinds of virtual interactions are exhausting. They're not satisfying to us in the same way. So what I really can tell you is I just want to acknowledge that that's absolutely true. And it's true for a lot of people in terms of feeling like it's really hard to manage all of this together. And so I would say, like, your biggest piece is to do a lot of self-care right now. Like, I know that might even sound a little bit lame and touchy-feely, but I can't express enough how important it is to take care of yourself, to really acknowledge the stress that you're under, and to really take time to meditate, to stretch, to go for a walk if that's possible, and to really give yourself a break, and to know that this is not going to maybe be your best work ever in the middle of a pandemic, but you are surviving and you're building resilience. You're building a lot of major critical thinking skills, you're building higher level skills, and they're going to be things that you're going to appreciate later on. We're in the middle of something right now. It's hard to get that perspective on it, but building resilience is one of the most important things that human beings can do to really protect your own happiness. And look, we've given you this great opportunity to build a lot of resilience right now.
And I think you missed a question from Chu Yu Han. She says, how can a science student improve and gain a better understanding in the field of liberal arts, as I believe these two things go hand in hand?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think the sciences also, just to acknowledge that sciences are also part of the liberal arts. They come out of that tradition. Science comes a little bit later in the tradition. The humanities come first and are obviously the best, but the sciences do follow along. I think there's lots of ways to think about how, when you're like, depending on your area of interest in the sciences, you know, I would use that as your, like, the thing that you love as your way into the liberal arts, right? So understanding those questions, understanding, and there's a lot of great science writers as well who really talk about, you know, I mean, science is so big, right? So I'm trying to think of a specific example, but the human, like, to help understand the human brain, to help really use that lens of the scientific method and bring it over into the humanities. We're learning in the humanities from the scientific method. We question the scientific method. We have our own methodologies, but they're in conversation. And so I think that really one of the things the sciences does so well is that, you know, articulation of a hypothesis, really marshaling evidence, and that's really important in liberal arts. Thinking about how you're using good evidence to support an argument. So I think one of the things that you can learn in science too is how to create an argument. I think so often in science, a lot of the papers are really, this is an overstatement, but, you know, are really testing a hypothesis out. And so, and in the lab and trying to test this hypothesis and see how true it is. I think being able to step back and understand, well, what's the methodology behind this? Like, where did this question come from? Why did people start asking this question? What is the application of this question? I think really helps to both improve your science writing and your argumentation skills, and then that argumentation skill is really critical in the liberal arts classroom. We really like to argue in a nice way.
Yeah, I think it's 10:30 in New York, 10:30 p.m. in New York. So Prof Ann was at a very long day. Prof, maybe just two quick responses to the last two questions at the bottom.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a third one that's come on. There's one from Deepashni. Does online learning really produce quality students? And one from the next one also online from Mohammad Ashraf. Prof, do you have any advice for us to focus more on online classes?
So I think that online learning can work well. And I think, you know, and of course, unfortunately, it's much more up to you as independent learners than it is when you're in a classroom or you have the reinforcement of a community around you. One of the things we know about online learning, especially about learning by yourself, is how much time you waste by yourself. So I have a couple of great tips that I've learned from some of, actually, again, in psychology, some of the great people that I know that do the science of learning. So one of the things is that we often study and restudy the things we already know really well. So because it's so much more comfortable, like when you're reading the first part of the textbook and you end up studying, I don't know if this happens to any of you, but you already know that part. And if you already can tell yourself something about it, stop studying for it. You don't need to do that anymore. You need to figure out what are the questions that you still have about this particular topic. And that's where you need to dive deep. So it doesn't do any good to sit for 8 hours at a time and read a textbook. Like, you're never going to absorb that. The human mind cannot read that much and absorb that much information. You can do bite-sized pieces of information in about 15 minutes. Even an hour and 38 minutes that we're in, I'm sure I've lost a ton of you. Like, you just can't pay attention for that. Nobody can pay attention that long. So really, you want to find the places that you don't understand. Like, where do you have the questions? And that's where you want to focus your energy on studying. I think that's a really key piece of advice. And spending a lot of time in front of the laptop is really tough. So I'm going back to that piece of it. Sitting robot, because the morning we need to attend class virtually, which is horrible and draining, and actually, again, a study show exhausting and not super productive for your brain in many ways. At night we need to do assignments that each subject at least gives 2 assignments and spend a lot of time in the laptop. I do think trying to get away from the laptop as much as you can is probably really critical. Are there assignments that you can do on a piece of paper? Are there things that you can do to rest your eyes? Is there a way to shift some of your attention to paper and pen and away from the computer, so you're not like constantly sucked in. And the computer has, you know, there's emails that are buzzing, there's this constant kind of adrenaline rush of feedback that happens in the computer, which is also exhausting. So really trying to limit some of that electronic stimulation can be really, really helpful. And again, you know, I think for online learning, it's really also about finding connections too, because this is so lonely in so many ways. We're so isolated. So being able to find a classmate, and this is one of the things that we noticed a lot early in the pandemic, is the natural study groups that form in a classroom when you sort of see, you know, that cute girl that's a little confused, or the really smart looking one that's going to be great in your study group. Like, you just don't have that connection. So I think for faculty, it's really great. And we've really advised faculty to set up study groups for students, because they can help faculty know the students better than you're going to know each other, because you're all sitting there on the screen with just a photo. And then being able to make those connections to test one another. And again, challenge yourself to find those places where you're confused in the lecture, where you're confused in the writing. And that's where you want to focus your time and energy, so that you're not just wasting 8 hours of a time just struggling to get through something and not really absorbing it, really taking it in smaller bites.
And I think we have to let you go. It's already we could go until midnight if you're willing, but
oh my God, it's so much fun. It's so much fun. This is so awesome to talk to you guys. I hope that you're gonna do fabulous. I'm so excited that you're out in the world solving all these problems for us. Thank you so much, Sanan, for inviting me to the conversation. This has really been a pleasure. And I really hope that we get a chance to meet in person, inviting you here to New York. Of course, anybody who wants to be in New York when the borders are open. And then I hope I get a chance to come and visit you in person in your beautiful, beautiful island.
Yeah. Maybe I could just inform students about some what we talked about, maybe having a joint session with your students someday.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah. So salah satu perkara yang kami bincang dengan Prof Ann, mungkin pelajar berminat, ialah ini sekarang masalah COVID, you tidak boleh jumpa rakan pelajar sendiri di dalam UMS. Tapi Prof Ann mencadangkan mungkin kita boleh berjumpa dengan pelajar dia di Amerika Syarikat dalam satu sesi online, mungkin ada perbincangan dialog antara pelajar di Malaysia dan pelajar di Amerika Syarikat, supaya tak payahlah anda mendengar orang tua saja bercakap, anda boleh berbincang dengan rakan pelajar anda di Amerika Syarikat. Dan ini kalaulah masa mengizinkan, ada kesempatan, kita mungkin membuka pulanglah pada cara hubungan antara sesama pelajar antara Amerika Syarikat dengan Malaysia, rancangan masa depan ya. And so I will keep your names because I remember we have the names of those of you who attended this seminar, so we'll keep in touch with you. I think Prof Ann would also appreciate.
I would love that.
Yeah.
We could do a class on maybe I could get my faculty on happiness to do a little session for you all on happiness, because we all could use it, and she's fabulous.
That would be fun. I like it.
Yes.
That would be great, yeah. So I just want to thank our seminar coordinator, Dr. Jamsari, Puan Erna, who's our online host today. And of course, thank you very much, Prof, and all the students who attended today's talk. Thank you so much for your questions. Sorry, we might not have had time to answer every question, but we really appreciate. Maybe just I don't know, Prof, do you have anything? Any last words?
I want to thank all the students, especially thank you, Sanan, for inviting me, and the students for the great questions and the conversations. It was so much fun. So I appreciate being able to stay up late with you guys and have this great conversation. It's like being in college, really.
So we've been talking about not having face-to-face interaction. So maybe those of you who are able, maybe just open your cameras so we can say, the Prof Ann can see your faces. Maybe some of you. Hi, Kennedy.
Hello.
Kennedy is a faculty at Liberal Arts.
Very nice to meet you, Kennedy. Hello. Like, look, people. Thank you so much.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So thanks so much, Anne. Yeah, nice meeting you again.
Nice to see you again, and nice to meeting all of you. I appreciate your time today. It was nice of you to start the morning off with me.
Okay, sure. Excellent. So we have a recording of this session. I hope everyone doesn't mind. We might be able to make it available. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Have a good
Prof.
day.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. Terima kasih ya. Terima kasih banyak ya kerana hadir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sabar.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, sir. Thank you, Prof.
So, harap ada aktiviti susulan lah yang anda boleh ikut dengan Prof Ann ya. Ini saya akan saya akan ambil maklum tentang pelajar-pelajar yang hadir hari ini lah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Stay safe, sir.
Okay, thank you. Anna, can I off the? Can I leave?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So recording dah tamat dah. Okay.